Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode in the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour, special series on the REINS Act. REINS Act in focus. I am Andrew Langer. Joining me today is Jonathan Wolfson. He is the, oh, good Lord, Chief Policy Director. Is that what we're calling us?
That's right.
Chief Policy Director with the Cicero Institute. They're a free market, limited government think tank doing great work on economic policy issues and regulatory policy issues. And Jonathan, appreciate you coming on. You and I have talked in the past about a lot of these issues, but let's get your perspective. The REINS Act, why is it important, and why is it important now?
Yeah, well, Andrew, thanks for having me on. Appreciate
Always.
the opportunity to chat. I think the REINS Act is in this moment in the country where lots of people are talking about regulation. One of the challenges is we don't have a lot of systems in place that allow the legislature to get itself back involved when the regulatory agencies decide to issue a regulation, right? There's the Congressional Review Act, which allows the legislature to affirmatively reach out and grab a regulation they don't like and vote it down. They can, pass a resolution of disapproval that the president has to sign. But the REINS Act really does try to say, hey, the point of regulations is when legislation is not clear for the agencies to try to fill in those blanks using the expertise the agency has in enforcing the laws and things of that nature. But the REINS Act really says, hey, if the agencies are going to fill in those blanks, but that's not the way Congress wanted those blanks filled in, Congress should get a second bite of the apple and a chance to say, hey, that's not really what we meant when we passed that law.
Not only that, but fill in the blanks as they see fit in a way that is supremely expensive and impactful on the U.S. economy. I mean, right, it would be one thing. We understand that a certain degree of deference has to be given, but obviously that's been reined in, no pun intended, or pun intended, with the Loper Bright decision last year. But when it's hugely expensive, and now that we seem to be getting some kind of regularity in terms of how we define what a major rule is, there's a reason why they call them major rules. Talk about the import there.
Yeah, so a major rule is defined by the Office of Management and Budget's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or as the regulatory nerds, all seven of us like to call it OIRA.
OIRA, yes.
Exactly. But they define it as something that has $100 million of impact, or depending on, when they changed Circular A4 in the last administration, $200 million of impact on the economy, or a significant impact on a particular aspect of the economy. But that's kind of the definition. So these are not kind of regulations of, hey, we're trying to deal with one little color of tape on the floor for an OSHA reg. This
right.
is, hey, we're going to say you can't run a certain type of electricity in a certain type of building across the country. And one of the reasons that you want to identify those major regulations and then require them to go back through some sort of approval process is there's no limitation on this delegation of authority to the agencies. And so the Environmental Protection Agency is issuing major rules, significant regulations that have hundreds of millions of dollars of impact based on statutes that were passed in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's one thing if Congress was saying, hey, we passed a law in 2024, you wrote a reg in 2025, and we think you didn't get it right. The bigger challenge is, and the REINS Act addresses this on the federal level, hey, we passed a law in the 1970s, and now you agency are coming up with a unique interpretation that has hundreds of millions of dollars of burden that's imposing on the economy. And we, the legislature, want a chance to say whether or not we think that aligns with what Congress and the people wanted when that law was passed in the first place.
It seems to me that every member of Congress should hunger for this, both Republicans and Democrats. We're going to get into the Democrat side of it in a second and why Democrats should support this. But let's go general here, which is this idea of, if something has been passed in the past, you should be able to say, you should want to say, whether or not this interpretation works. Talk about this.
Yeah, so if you're a member of the legislature, theoretically, if we go back to our schoolhouse rock days,
right?
Congress passes a law, the president signs it, and then the law is in place, and the agencies aren't part of that story, right?
Right.
And we know that the government has gotten bigger and complicated, and there are reasons that regulations do exist and probably need to exist. I'm not here to have that fight.
Right.
If
Of course.
you want to do a lunch 3-day podcast, maybe then we go through that whole fight. But there are reasons that regulations need to be on the books, and it's hard to pass really clear laws. But the reality is, if you're a member of the legislature and you have to pass a less than perfectly clear statute, you should want a chance to say, hey, you are coloring way outside the lines of what
Right.
we ever intended when we passed this statute. When Congress passed the law in the 1970s saying we're going to deal with the air quality in the United States and the Clean Air Act, no one at that time would have ever expected that meant you could ban coal-fired power plants.
Right.
But that's exactly what happens in the 2000s. And so, I think that's the reason that Congress should want to get involved and say, wait, agencies, you are acting on your own. You're not doing what we, the legislature, what we, the people of the United States want to have happen.
Well, set aside coal-fired power plants. Let's get down to, no way that Congress, envisioned someone saying you should force everybody in rural America to pave over a dirt parking lot, every business in America, and then, 5 years later come back and try to tax them on the impervious surface of their parking lot area. I mean, this is the ridiculousness of it. But let's also talk about power and how power can be abused, and why. What I love about the Cicero Institute is you guys are nonpartisan. So you recognize the danger of power, regardless of what side of the aisle folks are on. Why should Democrats, traditionally it's been Republicans pushing for the REINS Act, why should Democrats, Democrat legislators, why should they be interested in passing the REINS Act?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. So, if you're a Democrat legislator, or, honestly, a legislator of either side, but if you're a Democrat and you're kind of concerned, you're like, hey, this is a conservative thing of being against over-regulation, the reality is a large portion of policy making in the United States today is done via regulation. And that's at the federal level and at the state level. And so if you're a member of the legislature and maybe you are okay with regulation as a concept, right? Maybe you're not on board when I say, hey, regulation is an excessive burden. You might be okay with that philosophically as a Democrat. But the reality is every 4, 8, 12 years, there's going to be Republicans in the White House, and they're going to be running these agencies. And so you want a chance to say, hey, maybe the legislation that we passed in 2010 when President Obama was president shouldn't be used by President Trump today to advance a different policy agenda. And the second reason is, and I've got friends who've served as political appointees in both Republican and Democrat administrations, the reality is a lot of the people who work at the federal agencies don't necessarily think of themselves as agents of the president. They think of themselves as their job being to work for that agency and to work really hard for that agency. But unfortunately, that means that they may try to gum up the works, or they may themselves have policy positions and agendas that they want that run counter to where the president is of both parties. And
Right.
So in reality, you as the legislature, who is accountable to the people, are going to want a chance to step in those circumstances and say, hey, I think you're going way far away from where this is supposed to be. And especially if this is going to have that $100 million or more burden on the economy, if small businesses in a particular legislative member's district are going to be affected, they're going to want a chance to step in and say, hey, banning gas-fired stoves is not going to be good for the small restaurants that exist in my district, and that's going to be a problem.
Listen, I think about the various legislators in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago who have many pizzerias in their districts that may very well be coal or even natural gas fired, and they may actually, I should turn around, that may be natural gas fired or even coal fired. That certainly would be impacted by these sweeping kinds of rules. They should be interested in hearing from their constituents on these things. Let me peel it back, because I just had this conversation with Ike Brannon from the Jack Kemp Foundation, former OIRA official, about the objective nature of cost-benefit analysis. The Trump administration undid, thankfully, I just wrote a piece about this, undid the Circular A4, the guidance documents on this. But let's talk about the importance of objective measurement of costs of regulation. Why this is so vital in terms of having sound regulatory policy.
Yeah, well, if you're going to impose burdens on the people of the country, you want to make sure that those burdens are worth it, right? If I were to say to you, we're going to spend $1 billion, but no kid will ever die of cancer again, we'd all say that makes a ton of sense. And
Yes.
that might be a really good investment, right? That's a really smart use of money. On the flip side, if I said we're going to spend $1 billion and one piece of lunch meat is going to be slightly safer, so no one's going to get food poisoning this week at one particular festival, we might say, now that starts to seem like we're really spending way too much money to
Right.
do a not big thing. And the same thing is true with regulation. If OSHA is going to say, hey, we know that hundreds of people are falling off of massive pieces of scaffolding if they don't wear a harness, it makes a ton of sense to say, hey, businesses, we're going to require you to spend some resources to make sure that people aren't dying falling off. On the flip side, if we're talking about painters who are on 6 foot tall scaffolds in an 8 foot tall house, maybe that's a situation where the painters might not want to be
Right.
harnessed in. They might say, you know what? Yeah, people have fallen, but nobody's dying. They're breaking some arms every now and then, but the cost to bring in harnesses and all those other things might not make it make sense. And now we're just at risk of getting in trouble with OSHA. Those are the sorts of things you want your regulators to do. And if they're not doing them well, OIRA exists in part to be a second check on the agencies. There's also the Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy. They're providing their additional analysis. And you want all of these people to participate along with the public to say
Right.
to the agencies, hey, you're missing this important piece of the calculation. And we understand that you feel like this is the most protective or this is the right way to interpret the statute. But if you do so, you're going to be imposing burdens on farmers, on small businesses, on moms and dads across the country that may make it harder for them to live their lives. And it might not be something that they would be willing to spend their money on if they had to make those decisions. And that's not going to affect the people who make the most money, right? The millionaires and billionaires who people
Right.
like to, pillier, those folks can afford to buy a bigger car that can fit the bigger car seats. The hard part is going to be that single mom who is living paycheck to paycheck. And suddenly you say, hey, your kid's got to be in a car seat until they're 14 years old. And the car seats don't fit in the car that mom wants to drive. So now she's got to decide, do I put my kid supposedly at risk of dying by not having him in this car seat, but I then have to buy a car that I can't afford? Or do I just risk not following the rules?
It's interesting, right? Because it gets into this calculus. We have cars that are smaller, so they're more vulnerable. So we create these crumple zones in cars that are mandated. So now it becomes vastly more expensive. Anytime you just look wrong at a car bumper, you get a massive ding that costs $1,000 to fix. Jonathan, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at the Cicero Institute?
Yeah, so we're on our website is ciceroinstitute.org. We are also Institute Cicero on X. So look for us there. We post a lot on LinkedIn. We're working with a bunch of states around the country on regulatory issues, on healthcare issues, and a number of other things. Happy to work with governors, legislators, and other folks who are interested in advancing this agenda.
Jonathan Wolfson, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew. Really appreciate it.
Our guest has been Jonathan Wolfson from the Cicero Institute. Go and check them out online. This has been yet another episode in our ongoing series, REINS Act in Focus for the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.